Breaking experienced U.S. lawyer exposes 10 fatal errors in Nnamdi Kanu's life sentence. As appeal deadline approaches, today, February 2nd, 2026, we bring you something absolutely critical that will change how you understand Nnamdi Kanu's conviction. This is not speculation or emotional argument. This is a detailed legal analysis conducted by one of the most experienced lawyers in the United States, who has meticulously examined all 148 pages of the official court transcript that sentenced Mazi Nnamdi Kanu to life imprisonment on November 20th, 2025. Before we dive into these shocking revelations, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because what you are about to learn will demonstrate that the problems with this case go far beyond what most people understood. We all knew about the illegal rendition. We understood there were issues with how Kanu was brought from Kenya to Nigeria. But this experienced legal mind has gone through the judgment page by page, word by word, line by line, and has uncovered mistakes so fundamental, so numerous, and so legally devastating that the Court of Appeal will have serious questions to address. After you watch this analysis, you will see clearly every single error that occurred and understand why legal experts are saying this life sentence faces serious legal challenges. Let me show you the official transcript that is now under intense examination. This is the Federal High Court of Nigeria in the Abuja Judicial Division. The judgment delivered on Thursday, November 20th, 2025, before His Lordship Honorable Justice James Omotosho. This is the actual document, the real transcript, not a summary or interpretation. Within these 148 pages, experienced American lawyer Johnson Bright has identified 10 major categories of legal errors, each one potentially serious enough to impact the validity of the conviction. With the appeal deadline approaching in late February 2026, and with American observers and ICC investigators now on Nigerian soil following Kanu's letter to President Trump, these legal errors take on even greater significance. Error number 1 appears on pages 24 to 33 of the transcript and is titled Total Failure to Determine Illegal Rendition as Jurisdictional Issue. What does this mean in simple terms? The court treated the illegal rendition of Nnamdi Kanu from Kenya as merely a procedural complaint, a minor irregularity, rather than recognizing it as a jurisdiction-destroying defect. Why is this wrong? Because Nigerian courts and international law have settled that where a defendant is brought before a court by illegal means, the court must first determine the consequences for its jurisdiction before proceeding with trial. Justice Omotosho acknowledged in his judgment that Kanu was forcibly taken from Kenya. He admitted this fact openly, yet he refused to determine what legal consequences flow from that illegality. According to the legal analysis, jurisdiction cannot be waived, ignored, or postponed for later consideration. Once jurisdiction is tainted by illegal conduct in bringing the defendant before the court, the entire proceeding collapses. If the rendition is illegal and taints jurisdiction, everything built on that foundation fails. This is not just technical legal argument, it is fundamental to the rule of law. Error number 2 can be found on pages 27 to 29 and involves a remarkable contradiction. The court admits extraordinary rendition occurred, but then claims it is irrelevant to the court's competence to proceed. Think about the logical impossibility of that position. The judgment accepts the fact of abduction, but concludes it does not affect the competence of the court to try the case. How can a court simultaneously acknowledge illegality and declare it legally neutral with no consequences? This contradicts Supreme Court authority, violates the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which Nigeria has domesticated into law, and ignores Nigeria's Extradition Act. This is what lawyers call a self-contradictory judgment. You cannot say, on one hand, that illegal rendition occurred, and on the other hand, that it has no legal effect. Either the rendition was legal, in which case the court has jurisdiction, or it was illegal, in which case the court lacks jurisdiction. There is no middle ground where you admit illegality, but proceed anyway. This contradiction alone raises serious questions about the judgment's legal sustainability. Error number 3 appears on pages 30 to 32 and involves misapplication of the Ker-Frisbie Doctrine. Let me explain what this is, because many Nigerians may not be familiar with it. Ker versus Frisbie was an American case where a man committed a crime in the United States, fled to Mexico, and was brought back through irregular means. The American court ruled that how a defendant is brought before the court does not affect the court's power to try him. Justice Omotosho relied heavily on this American precedent, essentially importing foreign law to justify proceeding despite Kanu's illegal rendition from Kenya. But here is the critical error Johnson Bright identifies. The Ker-Frisbie Doctrine does not apply, and American courts themselves have recognized it does not apply. Where there is an extradition treaty between countries, where there is torture or cruel treatment, where there is abduction involving deception, or where the state is bound by human rights treaties that prohibit such conduct. Nigeria and Kenya have no extradition treaty. Nigeria is bound by the African Charter, by UN conventions, by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and by the Convention Against Torture. All of these international obligations that Nigeria has voluntarily undertaken prohibit the kind of extraordinary rendition that occurred. Therefore, relying on Ker-Frisbie was a misapplication of foreign law that ignored Nigeria's binding international obligations. Error number 4 is found on pages 40 to 44 and concerns failure to address bail revocation procedure properly. The court accepted that Kanu's bail was revoked without a fresh hearing, without formal service of notice, and without compliance with Section 36 of the Nigerian Constitution, which guarantees fair hearing. This is absolutely critical. When Kanu left Nigeria in 2017 after military invasion of his home, he was on court-granted bail. That bail was never formally revoked through proper legal process. There was no hearing where Kanu or his lawyers were given notice and opportunity to be heard. How can you say someone jumped bail when you never formally revoked the bail through due process? This violates fundamental procedural fairness. Error number 5 spans pages 60 to 68
Nnamdi
and
Kanu,
involves
the
selective
leader
use of
of the
affidavit
indigenous
evidence.
peoples of Biafra,
Affidavits
has
submitted
just been
by Kanu's
summoned to
defense
appear
addressing
in
the
court
illegal abduction
tomorrow
were
in
dismissed
Abuja.
or ignored,
Now, I know what
while
you are
affidavits
thinking.
from the government
Why
were
is this
accepted
such
without
big
proper
news?
scrutiny
Well,
or critical
let
evaluation.
me break it down for you
Courts
in a
have a
way that
duty
will
to
make
evaluate
complete sense.
conflicting
And trust
affidavit
me,
evidence
this story
fairly,
has more
not
drama
to choose
than a
sides
Nollywood
silently.
movie.
Just
Just last week,
violates the
on
principle of
November
judicial
20th,
neutrality.
Justice
A
James
judge must
Omotosho
weigh evidence from
sentenced
both
Nnamdi
sides
Kanu to
equally
life
and
in
explain
prison.
why one version
Yes,
is
you heard that
accepted
right.
over another.
Life imprisonment.
Simply
The
accepting
judge
government
found him
evidence
guilty
while
on
dismissing
7
defense
different
evidence
terrorism
without
charges,
analysis
and the whole
raises
thing happened
questions
in a
about
very dramatic
impartiality.
way.
Error
Kanu
number
was
6
actually
appears on
removed from the
pages
courtroom
70
by
to
security
75
agents
and
because the
concerns
judge said
failure
he
to
was being
address
unruly.
diplomatic and
Can you
territorial
imagine?
breach.
He kept
The
insisting
judgment
that the court
contains
had
no
no right to judge
determination
him, that
regarding
they did not
3
have
key
jurisdiction
factors:
over him.
that Kenya's
But the judge
sovereignty
went
was
ahead
breached by
and
the
delivered the
abduction,
judgment,
that there was
even
no
though Kanu was
extradition
not in the
order
room
from any
anymore.
competent
Now,
authority,
the judge
and
could
that
have
there was
given
no
him the
Kenyan
death
court
penalty,
process
but he
involved.
chose life
Why
imprisonment
does this
instead.
matter? Because without an extradition treaty or order, Nigeria had no legal custody of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. You cannot simply take someone from another country without following that country's laws and international protocols. The absence of any discussion of these diplomatic and territorial violations represents a failure to address fundamental jurisdictional requirements. Error number 7 is found on pages 90 to 105 and involves mischaracterization of charges and speech evidence. The core problem here is that political speech was treated as terrorism and incitement, without meeting statutory thresholds that define what constitutes criminal incitement or terrorism. Every statement Kanu made should have been analyzed as political speech, which is protected under freedom of expression, unless the prosecution proved it crossed the line into criminal territory. The analysis identifies multiple failures. No causal link was shown between Kanu's words and specific violent acts. No means were established showing how his broadcasts directly caused violence. No territorial nexus was proven, and criminal liability was assumed rather than proven through evidence. The basic point is clear. The prosecution did not meet its burden of proving beyond reasonable doubt that Kanu's political statements constituted terrorism under the legal definition. Error number 8 covers pages 110 to 118 and addresses failure to consider abuse of process doctrine. The judgment ignored clear indicators of abuse of process, including multiple amended charges that kept changing, prolonged detention spanning years, and executive disobedience of court orders, including the Court of Appeal order that discharged Kanu in 2022. When charges are repeatedly amended, when detention extends for unreasonable periods, and when the executive branch openly disobeys court orders, this constitutes abuse of process. The court's refusal to address these issues contradicts settled Nigerian jurisprudence. Error number 9 deals with the repealed terrorism law issue. As Barrister Christopher Chidera of the Mazi Nnamdi Kanu Defense Consortium has publicly stated, Kanu was convicted under the Terrorism Prevention Amendment Act of 2013, which was repealed by the Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act of 2022. The defense argues you cannot convict someone under a law that no longer exists. The prosecution argues the 2022 Act contains saving clauses, but the judgment failed to properly analyze this critical issue and determine whether jurisdiction existed under a repealed statute. Error number 10 identifies overall structural defects throughout the entire 148-page judgment. The fundamental structural problem is that the court decided guilt-related issues before properly establishing jurisdiction. This reverses the lawful order that every court must follow. First establish jurisdiction and competence. Only then proceed to consider the merits of the case. Anything built on a defective foundation collapses in law. Let me summarize the core errors in simple terms. First, the foundation of Kanu's trial was wrong because illegal rendition destroys jurisdiction. Second, due process was not followed at multiple stages. Third, the illegal rendition issue was not properly addressed despite being acknowledged. Fourth, international due process requirements that Nigeria is bound to follow were ignored. These are fundamental legal requirements that determine whether a trial is valid. Now, what is the way forward as the appeal deadline of late February 2026 approaches? Many experienced lawyers are giving the same strategic advice to Kanu's legal team. When you enter the Court of Appeal, do not get distracted by small procedural issues. Focus entirely on illegal rendition, because that is the issue that destroys the entire foundation of the case. Think of it this way. If your house is burning, and simultaneously a thief snatches your phone worth 5,000 naira, which problem do you address first? Obviously, you focus on saving your house from the fire. You do not abandon the burning house to chase a small phone. Similarly, this is a life sentence we are talking about. The illegal rendition is the issue that can consume the entire prosecution case. That is where all energy and argument must be concentrated. Accept other points when raised, but do not get sidetracked. When it is time to discuss illegal rendition, that is where maximum focus belongs, because that issue alone may determine whether this conviction survives. This comprehensive analysis from experienced lawyer Johnson Bright, combined with the approaching appeal deadline and the recent involvement of American observers sent by President Trump and ICC investigators now on Nigerian soil, creates unprecedented legal and diplomatic pressure. The American observers arrived specifically because of Kanu's letter to President Trump demanding inquiry into alleged Igbo killings. The ICC investigators are examining the illegal rendition from Kenya. All of this converges as Kanu's legal team prepares the appeal from Sokoto prison, where he was transferred over 700 kilometers from Abuja. The practical challenges are significant. Kanu initially chose to represent himself after disengaging his previous legal team, but compiling an effective appeal from detention in Sokoto, far from court registries and legal resources in Abuja, presents enormous obstacles. His younger brother Emmanuel attempted to appear for him, but was rejected because he is not a lawyer. Justice Omotosho emphasized that Kanu needs proper legal representation to effectively prosecute his constitutional right of appeal. Currently, lawyers from the Legal Aid Council are assisting, though challenges remain. On January 27, 2026, the Federal High Court is scheduled to hear arguments on Kanu's motion seeking transfer to a facility closer to Abuja to facilitate appeal preparation. This practical issue matters because effective legal defense requires access to lawyers, documents, and court registries. Meanwhile, a separate appeal challenging alleged violations of his fundamental rights by the DSS was struck out by the Court of Appeal on November 28, 2025, with the court ruling it had become academic following his conviction. As these 10 errors identified by Johnson Bright are examined alongside the involvement of international observers, the question becomes whether Nigeria's Court of Appeal will conduct a thorough review of the legal foundation of this conviction. Will they address the jurisdictional questions raised by illegal rendition? Will they examine whether a conviction under a repealed law can stand? Will they consider whether due process was truly followed? The answers will determine not just Kanu's fate, but will test whether Nigeria's judicial system operates according to constitutional principles and rule of law. Subscribe now to follow every development as this historic appeal unfolds. Share this video so every Nigerian understands the legal errors identified in this analysis. Drop your comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think of these revelations. The Court of Appeal will soon face these questions directly. Stay tuned for updates as the late February deadline approaches.